Before we start on the joint movement, let us know first what are the flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and circumduction to deeply understand the topic. Flexion decreases the angle between two structures as they bend or move closer together. Extension increases the angle between two structures as they bend or move away. Here is an example of flexion and extension. Flexion occurs when the angle decreases and the elbow moves together, whereas extension occurs when the angle increases and the elbow or shoulder moves away. Adduction. It occurs as the structure is assessed back towards the middle reference point. Abduction occurs when the movement of a structure away from its middle reference point. Here is an example of adduction and abduction. Abduction is when the shoulder is away from the midline reference point, while adduction is when it gets back to the midline reference point. Circumduction is blend of flexion, abduction, extension, and adduction. This joint permit conical or circular movement. Here is an example of circumduction. Circumduction is just blend of the four, which are the flexion, abduction, extension, and adduction. The movement of the four permits circular movement. Gliding joints, also known as the plane joint. It is a common type of synovial joint formed between bones that meets at early flat articular surfaces. This is an example of gliding joint. Its movement are up, down, left, right, and diagonally. An example of gliding joints is trying to make a wave which moves from right to left. Hinge joint. It is a type of joint that moves only in one direction, back and forth. It is a bone joint in which the articular surfaces are molded to each other that results to permit one motion only. This is an example of hinge joint. Its movement are extension and flexion. This is an example of movement that can be performed by hinge joint. As you can see, we are using the flexion and extension movements. Pivot joint, also known as rotary joint, a type of synovial joint that permits axial rotation and it rotates along the axis. A pivot joint can only move in an axial rotation, and this is the best example of a pivot joint. Condyloid joint, also known as condylar, ellipsoidal, or bicondylar. It is an ovoid articular surface or condyle that is received into an elliptical cavity. This is an example of condyloid joint. This joint is more like an oval shape. This permits movement into a place, allowing flexion and extension, abduction, adduction, and circumduction. This is an example of condyloid joint. As you can see in the video, we permit the extension, adduction, abduction, and circumduction movements. Saddle joint, also known as cellar joint. It is a type of synovial joint in which the opposing surfaces are reciprocally concave and convex. As you can see in the picture, concave is a surface that curves in inward, while convex is a surface that curves in outward, or a sphere. Here is an example of saddle joint. It permits flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and circumduction movements. Ball and socket joint, also known as spheroid joint. It is a type of synovial joint in which the ball-shaped surface of one round bone fits to the cup-like depression of another bone. Here are the two examples of ball and socket joint. This allows movement in all axes. First, let's see the hip joint. It has a deep socket and it gives stability but limits the range of motion, while the shoulder joint has a shallower socket and it gives a greater range of motion but it takes away some stability.